Good afternoon, everyone. I greet you with Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be upon you. I want to thank the organizers. It's a privilege to be here in this important event to understand how different faith traditions have a place within the narrative and how we can develop that narrative even further. So I'm going to be speaking about Islam in early America. I'm not going to read a paper, but I'm going to present some slides to kind of give more of a broader perspective of the place of Muslims and Islam in these early centuries of the American experience. I can see if I can advance this slide here. Let's see. Okay, so just as a point, oftentimes, in our public memory of Islam, probably we think about, well, since 9/11, 2001, or perhaps going back a few decades to the Immigration Act, 1965, and immigration since then, which has resulted in the Muslim population today in America, which is perhaps 1 to 2% of the U.S. population. There are different estimates of the total number, something like, I would say, 4 to 6 million Muslims in the United States today. But we can appreciate the fact that Muslims have been present in these lands since the earliest period of European or Afro-Eurasian presence in the New World. One of the earliest figures who's attested in documentation amongst the Spanish conquistadors is a figure named Estevanico de Azamor. He was apparently a Moroccan or Moorish person from Morocco who had gotten enslaved by the Portuguese and the Spanish, and he became part of an expedition of the Spaniards out of Cuba into Florida, and then the expedition, of course, faced hostilities with the native people and dwindled in size, and Estevanico was one of 4 people ultimately made their way across the southern United States into the Southwest and New Mexico. He died in New Mexico after many years of exploration in search for Cibola, along with his fellow explorers. So Estevanico is considered probably the earliest Muslim to set foot in these lands. But the larger majority of Muslims came from West Africa as amongst the enslaved population. I'd just like to read a quote from an academic scholar. "The contributions of African Muslims in colonial American life are often lost in discussions of the formation of the United States. Though their names and stories can be pieced together through archival records, the early history of African Muslims in the American South has long been under-acknowledged by scholars and in the American memory at large." So Muslims today in the United States, contemporary Muslims, are looking for ways to inscribe their story into our collective understanding of American history. A big part of that is an acknowledgement and an uplifting of the presence of Muslims who were enslaved in West Africa and brought to the southern United States and continued to practice their faith. Sometimes in secret, sometimes with great difficulty. They weren't necessarily forcibly converted to Christianity. Initially, there was opposition to that kind of activity because it felt that it might equalize, the standards of these people and make it more challenging, I think, for Christians to maintain segregation. So there wasn't necessarily that internal or external push to convert to Christianity, but circumstances did not really make it convenient or congenial for Muslims to practice their faith. Their dietary habits, of course, not consuming pork, the prayer times that they try to adhere to, and the language, the Arabic language that they try to preserve. And there is evidence that some scholars who were enslaved did make attempts to preserve their language and religion and pass it down. It's interesting to note that Thomas Jefferson, whom we heard a lot about last night in a wonderful keynote, collected a variety of scriptures from different religious traditions, including an English translation of the Quran. We don't know to what extent he consulted the text of the Quran in terms of some of the ideas that are present there, I would say, and I'll share a little bit about that in a few minutes, that I think align with notions of freedom and freedom of conscience and freedom of religion that Enlightenment thinkers themselves had articulated within the Western tradition. Muslims often like to point out the fact that the first nation outside of France that recognized the United States as an independent nation from England was the Kingdom of Morocco. And a treaty was established, and a delegation from Morocco was sent to Philadelphia, I believe, to engage with some of the founding fathers. A treaty was established thereafter, and Morocco, even today, Moroccans, if you go visit Morocco, they will say with great pride that they were the ones who acknowledged the United States. But nonetheless, there was conflict between the fledgling United States government and various parties in the Mediterranean in North Africa. The Barbary Wars were undertaken in 1801 to 1816, so conflicts in terms of ransoming American sailors or merchants who had been enslaved by North African Muslims, and the American government was paying tribute in order to release those captives, and at some point they decided that it was not worth it to keep paying those ransoms, and they built a navy, right? So this was an impetus for the United States to create the Navy and the Marines, and so that's an episode that is also worth keeping in mind in terms of our construction of a narrative about the relationships between the United States and the Muslim world at large. Coming back to the experience of the African Muslims who had been enslaved, along with Africans of other backgrounds, not just Muslims, but we do have evidence of certain individuals, such as the ones that are displayed. I'm sorry, I haven't been advancing the slides. So this is Thomas Jefferson's Quran, and then Morocco acknowledging the United States, and we talked about the Barbary Wars, and here we are. Okay, apologies for that. So Omar ibn Said was a very famous Senegalese scholar who was enslaved in North Carolina. Bilali Muhammad was another such figure. These are some of the texts that are available that have been preserved from their writings in Arabic. Ayuba Suleiman Diallo and Ibrahima Abdul Rahman were enslaved. They lived in the United States for a period of time, several decades, and then they were manumitted and able to return back to West Africa, to their homes. I'll read just another quick excerpt from a text that I consulted. There was a figure named Charles Ball who escaped slavery after spending some time in bondage in South Carolina. And he mentions Muslims in his own memoir, a slave memoir that was published in 1837. He was not a Muslim himself. Ball writes, "I knew several who must have been, from what I have since learned, Mohammedans, as Muslims were known. Though at that time I had never heard of the religion of Muhammad. One of the people Ball may have later realized was a practicing Muslim was his own grandfather. Ball witnessed his grandfather's unfamiliar habits without knowing of the existence of Islam, but describes them in a way that aligns closely with Islamic practice and belief, perhaps the bowing and the recitation in Arabic." It's also worth noting that in the Revolutionary War, archival records suggest that about 300 individuals that can be traced in terms of their names were Muslim. So that's probably like 1 in 10,000 members, either on the 1 in 10,000 members in the Revolutionary War, and actually even in the Civil War. There were Muslims fighting on both sides of the conflict. So small number of people, but there is evidence that they were present. Okay. Just going a little bit beyond the 1700s, we get into the mid-19th century, and that's when we start to see a greater influx of immigrants from Syria and Lebanon, who are Middle Eastern but white passing, and they assimilate into American society at large, in the North particularly. But Islam starts to be known as a religious tradition. One of the famous converts, maybe one who could be considered a founding father of Islam in the United States, is Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb, who became the spokesperson for Islam at the World's Parliament in 1893 when the World's Fair took place, and various religious traditions were represented in that event. So we often hark back to Alexander Russell Webb. Another interesting figure in that time period in the 1850s is an immigrant from the Ottoman lands who was an expert in raising camels, and the United States government hired him to go out and try to develop a camel corps in the American Southwest as a means of traversing the desert landscape. And he's buried in Arizona. Hi, Jolly. And then I want to talk just for a few minutes about notions of pluralism that may be found in the Quran and the Islamic tradition. So there is a passage in the Quran, one of the verses is very explicit. Of course, this is pertaining to the time of Muhammad the Prophet himself in the 7th century, dealing with pagan Arabs and their desire for him to create a syncretic religion where Muhammad would acknowledge their gods and they would be willing to acknowledge Allah or God. And revelation came down to Muhammad in this language that he should recite to them, "For you is your religion and for me is my religion." So there was a clear sense that it wasn't going to be a scenario where they could create a mixture of religions, but that they would have to maintain these sort of boundaries and sort of emphasis on monotheism that Islam is founded upon. So there is a sense of theological integrity in this particular passage, and it actually facilitates a sense of pluralism because it involves the coexistence of different religious systems. And then another passage, "Let there be no compulsion in religion." Muslims often cite this as an important foundational principle in their own engagement with people of other religious traditions, that it's simply impossible to force someone to embrace a belief system that they don't actually believe in. They might outwardly, under compulsion, state something, but internally, obviously, they still maintain their conviction. So the Quran is acknowledging that this is actually a truism, that there cannot be any sort of compulsion in religion. So I think that this accords well with some of the concepts that Enlightenment thinkers themselves were developing and producing in their writings. And then lastly, this particular passage. So the Quran is instructing the Muslims, the followers of Muhammad, that they shouldn't get into a lot of disputations with people of other religious traditions, but they should encourage one another to compete in good works, to acknowledge that there's belief in one God, that there's belief in the prophets, that there's belief in scriptures, that there's belief in a day of judgment and accountability. And rather than getting bogged down in disputation, focus on doing good works and competing with each other in that regard. So these are important passages within the Quran that I believe provide a foundation for thinking about how Muslims can, in the United States particularly, and in the West in general, can integrate their political theology, their political thought about freedom of conscience and freedom of religion within the larger conversation. Thank you very much.